She had been told it was a promise, written on thin paper that smelled of the sea and then of dust. Now, the paper was all she had. And Lee sat on the rough-hewn shipping crate, the only thing on the station platform that seemed to belong to no one, and watched the train that had carried her across a continent shrink into a black smudge against the vast, unforgiving white of the landscape. The promise had been for a husband, a merchant named Mr. Lee in a town called Terminus. He would be waiting. He was not. The station agent, a man with a drooping mustache and weary eyes, had looked at the address on the top letter, then at her, then back at the letter. He had shaken his head slowly. There was no Mr. Lee, he'd said. Not a merchant, not anyone. The name was a ghost. He had offered her a stale biscuit from a tin, an act of pity that felt sharper than a blow. She had refused with a slight bow of her head, her dignity the only currency she had left. She was 18. The light blue silk of her cheongsam, a color meant for celebration, was a mockery under the heavy gray sky. A coarse wool scarf, a gift from her mother, was wrapped tight around her neck, but the cold was a living thing, seeping through the thin soles of her shoes and up into her bones. The people of Terminus, the few who scurried from one weathered building to another, glanced at her and then away. She was a curiosity, a piece of porcelain left in a scrap yard, too foreign to touch, too fragile to last. They saw the silk dress, the dark, neatly coiled hair, the small, still figure on the crate, and they saw a problem they did not want. Inside her sleeve, her fingers traced the edges of the bundled letters. They were tied with a red ribbon, now faded to a dusty pink. For months, they had been her reality. They spoke of a prosperous future, of a general store with bolts of fabric and barrels of spice. They spoke of a home waiting for her. The words were elegant, the calligraphy sure and strong. They were a lie. Every single one. She did not weep. Tears were a luxury, and she had learned long ago to be frugal with everything. Instead, she performed the quiet arithmetic of survival. She had a small bundle with a change of clothes, a comb, and the letters. She had no money. She knew no one. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and orange. When the light was gone, the true cold would arrive. She sat, and she waited, though she no longer knew what for. The wind was the only thing that answered, pulling at the threads of her scarf, whispering of an ending. Jonah saw her from a distance, a slash of pale blue against the grimy grey of the station. He was in town for salt and flour, a trip he made only when necessity outweighed his dislike of people. He had his own ghosts, and they did not care for company. His first instinct was to turn his wagon around. He had enough trouble. He had his younger brother, Samuel, to feed, and a farm that took more than it gave. A foreign girl in a fancy dress was no part of his world. But he had seen the train leave hours ago. He had seen the sun begin to set. And he saw that she had not moved. She was a statue of abandonment. He pulled the wagon to a halt, the steam pluming from the mule's nostrils. He did not get down. He just watched her for a long moment. She was small, but she was not slumped. Her back was straight. Her hands were tucked into her sleeves. There was a stillness about her that was not defeat, but a kind of deep, patient endurance. It was a quality he understood. It was the way you waited out a blizzard, the way you faced a bad harvest. You braced, and you held on. He thought of his wife, Martha, who had faced her sickness with that same quiet steel. The thought was a familiar ache, a hollowed-out space in his chest. He was supposed to be done with this. Done with caring for fragile things. But the cold did not care for resolutions. It would kill her as surely as a bullet. He clicked his tongue, and the mule took a few reluctant steps closer. And Lee looked up as the shadow of the wagon fell over her. His face was hard, carved by wind and loss, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He was a big man, his frame filling out a heavy sheepskin coat. He looked dangerous. He looked like the land itself. He said nothing, just looked at her, then at the small bundle beside her. You waiting on someone? His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. She understood the tone, if not every word. She shook her head once. Got a place to go. Another shake. He cursed under his breath, a low, frustrated sound. He looked up at the darkening sky, then back at her. It was a choice between his peace and her life. It was not much of a choice at all. He hated it. He hated the complication she represented, the intrusion. He hated the pity he felt, because pity was a weakness he could not afford. He jerked his head toward the back of the wagon. Get in. It was not an invitation. It was a command born of weary necessity. And Lee hesitated for only a second. She looked at his hard face, then at the vast, empty snowfield stretching into the night. She picked up her bundle, the letters still clutched in her hand, and walked to the wagon. She climbed into the back without a word, settling herself between a sack of flour and a barrel of salt. She pulled her scarf tighter and did not look back at the station where her promised life had ended. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels crunching on the frozen ground, carrying her away from one kind of emptiness and into another. The cabin was 2 rooms, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. It smelled of wood smoke, old sorrows, and unwashed wool. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, the only source of warmth and light. A young man, who looked to be a younger version of Jonah, sat at a crude table, mending a piece of tack. He looked up when they entered, his eyes narrowed with instant suspicion. "What's this?" he asked, his voice sharp. She was at the station. "Freezing," Jonah said, shrugging out of his coat. He did not look at Lee. He was already regretting it. The cabin was too small. Her presence filled it, a silent, fragrant question. "We ain't got room." "We barely got enough for us," the young man, Samuel, said. He stared at Anneli's blue dress with open disdain. "She can have the corner by the hearth." "For the night," Jonah stated. It was final. He began to unload the supplies, his movements economical and loud in the tense silence. Lee stood by the door, her bundle held in front of her like a shield. She understood this language perfectly. The closed-off man who had brought her here. The hostile boy who wished her gone. It was the universal tongue of the unwanted. She knew her role. To be small. To be quiet. To take up as little space as possible. She did not wait to be told. She found a nail by the door and hung her thin cloak. She set her bundle down in the corner Jonah had indicated. The floor was packed earth, cold and hard. She saw a broom made of bound twigs and, without a word, began to sweep the hearth, her movements fluid and noiseless. She was not asking for a place. She was trying to earn the air she breathed. Samuel watched her, his jaw tight. Jonah watched her from the corner of his eye as he stacked tins on a shelf. He saw the way she moved, with a purpose that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with work. The house had been clean, but it had been a man's clean, functional, scrubbed, but without grace. Her small act of sweeping was different. It was an act of tending. It was Martha's kind of act. The thought made the ache in his chest sharpen. That night, she was offered a plate of stew. It was thin, mostly potatoes and a few scraps of salted meat. She waited until both men had taken their fill before she accepted the smallest portion, eating it slowly, silently. When she was done, she took the wooden bowls to a basin of water and washed them, her back to the room. She was erasing herself, one small act at a time. She lay down on the hard floor, a spare horse blanket for a mattress, and stared into the dying embers of the fire. She thought of the letters, of the elegant lies that had brought her to this cold, silent house. She had traded one kind of cage for another. The only difference was that this one had no pretense of a gilded door. The next morning, she was still there. Neither Jonah nor Samuel spoke of it. It was an unspoken, unratified fact. Lee rose before the sun, rekindled the fire from the embers, and put a pot of water on to heat. She had seen the men's mending pile, a heap of torn shirts and socks in a basket. She took it to her corner and, using a small kit from her bundle, began to sew. Her stitches were tiny and perfect, a neat, disciplined line that closed the frayed edges as if they had never been torn. She worked all day, fueled by a cup of weak tea and a piece of dry bread. She did not speak unless spoken to, and she was not spoken to. She just worked. One small thing at a time. A week passed in this manner. The men would leave at dawn to check traps or chop wood, their world one of brute survival against the winter. Annelie's world became the four walls of the cabin. She learned its rhythms, its scarcities. She discovered a small patch of wild herbs near the creek, half frozen but still pungent, and added them to the stew, transforming its flat taste into something savory and warm. She reorganized the pantry, stacking the tin so neatly that Jonah could find what he needed in the dark. She took the hardened, almost unusable ends of the bread loaves, soaked them in water, and fried them in the little bacon grease they had, creating a hot, filling breakfast. Samuel remained hostile. He saw her work not as a contribution but as an invasion. She was changing the shape of their grief, smoothing over the rough edges he felt they deserved to live with. He would watch her, his expression a mixture of resentment and a grudging respect he would never admit to. He tested her, leaving a deliberate mess, which she would clean without comment. He would speak curtly, which she would answer with a polite nod. He was waiting for her to break, to complain, to demand something. She never did. Jonah was quieter in his observations. He noticed the way the fire seemed to burn brighter. He noticed the mended cuff of his favorite shirt, the seam so fine it was nearly invisible. He noticed the smell of herbs when he walked in the door, a scent that pushed back against the cabin's stale air of loss. He said nothing. Acknowledgement was a form of acceptance, and he was not ready for that. But one evening, Anneli returned from fetching water to find a low stool in her corner, newly made from a stump of pine, sanded smooth. There was no word of explanation. It was just there. A piece of silent reciprocation. An object that spoke where the man could not. The first to truly soften was not human. It was Clementine, the mule, a creature as stubborn and ill-tempered as the land itself. She would bite and kick at anyone who came near her with a bridle. One afternoon, Anneli went to the lean-to where the mule was kept. Samuel scoffed from the doorway, expecting to see her chased out. But Anneli did not approach with a bridle. She simply stood near the animal, humming a low, soft tune from her village. Clementine's ears twitched. The girl held out a hand, not to grab, but simply open. The mule snorted, then took a hesitant step forward and nudged her palm with its soft nose. From that day on, Anneli was the only one Clementine would allow to bridle her without a fight. Samuel watched the entire exchange, his mouth slightly agape. It was a small, inexplicable piece of magic, and it chipped away at the wall of his resentment. The turning point with the boy came during a spell of bitter cold. He had a cough that had settled deep in his chest. Anneli brewed one of her teas, a steaming, fragrant concoction of pine needles and the herbs she had gathered. She held the mug out to him. No, he rasped, turning away. She did not retreat. She simply stood there, holding the mug. It will help, she said, her voice soft but firm. The steam rose between them. He glared at her, then at the mug, then back at her. Finally, with an angry sigh, he snatched it from her hand and drank. The warmth spread through his chest, and the rattling cough eased. He did not thank her. But the next morning, when he went out to chop wood, he left a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the stool in her corner. It was crude, but the effort was plain. It was his stool. His answer. Jonah's reciprocation remained practical, silent. He noticed her shoes were thin, the soles worn through. He took them one night while she slept. Using leather from a ruined steel bag and his skill with an awl, he cut new soles and painstakingly stitched them on. He conditioned the worn tops with grease until they were supple again. He left them by the hearth, warmer and stronger than they had been before. When Anneli saw them, she ran her fingers over the thick, even stitches. She looked over at Jonah, who was sharpening a knife, his head bent, refusing to meet her gaze. She said nothing, but a slow warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it almost hurt. It felt like being seen. It was during these quiet weeks that she finally allowed herself to examine the letters again. Not for comfort, but for answers. She spread them out on the floor in her corner, the dim firelight flickering over the elegant script. The promise of a life with a prosperous merchant, Mr. Lee. She now knew there was no Mr. Lee. But the letters were real. The paper was expensive, the ink of high quality. Someone had paid for them. Someone had arranged her passage. Her eyes fell on a detail she had previously ignored. The letters were postmarked from a larger city to the east, but they spoke with intimate knowledge of Terminus, mentioning a new vein at the old silver mine and the name of the town clerk, a Mr. Davies, who was apparently a friend of the fictional Mr. Lee. A cold dread, sharper than the winter wind, settled in her stomach. Mr. Davies. She had seen him in town. A portly man with a tidy suit and a smile that never reached his eyes. He ran the land office and served as the town's unofficial banker and lawyer. He was a man of respectability. She remembered him looking at her on that first day at the station, his gaze lingering a moment too long. The letters had been a law. The prosperous husband was the bait. But what was the trap? She carefully folded the papers and tied them with a faded ribbon. They were no longer a failed promise. They were evidence. But of what, she did not yet know. She tucked them away, her fear a cold, hard stone inside her. She said nothing to Jonah or Samuel. It was her secret, her danger. The blizzard arrived without warning. One afternoon the sky turned a leaden grey, and a few lazy flakes began to fall. By nightfall, the world was a howling vortex of white. The wind shrieked like a dying animal, rattling the cabin's single window and forcing snow through the cracks in the walls. For 3 days, they were prisoners. The world shrank to the 2 rooms, the sound of the storm, and the flickering firelight. This was the crisis Jonah and Samuel were built for. They were grimly efficient, securing the door, rationing the wood. But it was Anelli's quiet preparations that made the difference. The carefully preserved herbs made nourishing broths that kept their strength up. The neatly stacked woodpile she had insisted on completing meant they did not have to ration the fire as severely. She had even found a small leak in the roof weeks earlier and pointed it out to Jonah, who had patched it. Now, that small act of observation saved them from a cascade of melting snow that would have ruined their flour. Trapped in the close confines of the cabin, the silence that had defined their lives began to fray. On the second night of the storm, Samuel, feverish from his lingering cough, began to mutter in his sleep. Unlee sat by his cot, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth. Jonah watched her from across the room, the firelight carving deep shadows on his face. "You're good with him," he said, his voice low. It was the first personal thing he had ever said to her. "I had younger brothers," she replied, her gaze not leaving Samuel. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty, but filled with unspoken questions. Later, as the wind howled, he found her staring into the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. "Why did you come here?" he asked, his voice gentle. She told him. Not all at once, but in small, spare sentences that painted a picture of her life. A village struck by famine. A family with too many mouths to feed. A matchmaker who brought the letters, a lifeline that promised one less daughter to worry about. She spoke of hardship not as a tragedy, but as a simple fact of life, like the rising of the sun. She explained that she knew how to stretch food because she had never known a time of plenty. She knew how to mend because new things were an impossible luxury. Her competence was not a talent, it was a scar. Jonah listened, and for the first time, he understood the depth of her stillness. It was not passivity. It was the profound strength of someone who had survived far worse than a cold train station. He looked at this small, quiet woman and saw a resilience that matched his own. The ghost of Martha was still there, a constant, quiet ache. But for the first time, it felt like there might be room for something else alongside it. Not a replacement, but an addition. The storm had trapped them, but it had also broken down the walls between them, leaving something new and fragile in its place. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was pristine and silent, buried under a thick blanket of snow. The sunlight was blinding. The immediate threat was over, but a new one was on its way. A few days later, a man on horseback appeared, making his way slowly through the deep drifts. It was Mr. Davies. He dismounted, his fine leather boots sinking into the snow. He smiled his polished, empty smile. "Mr. Bell," he said, nodding to Jonah. "I came to check on you." And on the young lady his eyes settled on Anne Lee, who stood in the cabin doorway. His gaze was proprietary, assessing. "There has been a most unfortunate misunderstanding. Your intended, Mr. Lee, was called away on urgent business. A family tragedy." The lie was smooth, practiced. Jonah stood impassively, his hand resting near the axe propped against the cabin wall. "She's fine here." Of course, Davies said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "But it is hardly a suitable arrangement. A young, unmarried woman in a house with 2 bachelors. Tongues will wag. For her own protection, for her reputation, it would be best if she came back to town with me. I have arranged a position for her. Housekeeper for the mayor." A respectable post. He made it sound like an act of supreme charity. The menace was in the reasonableness of his tone. He was weaponizing concern. "She stays," Jonah said. The words were flat. Final. Davies's smile tightened. "I'm not sure you understand, Mr. Bell. I am her benefactor in this country. I hold her papers. I am legally responsible for her welfare. If you refuse to cooperate, I will have to involve the sheriff. It would be a shame to bring that kind of trouble to your door." He was not asking. He was threatening, politely. He looked at Anne Lee. "Get your things, my dear. We wouldn't want any unpleasantness." Anneli's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the trap. The respectable position was a lie, just like the husband. He wanted to control her, to own her. She looked at Jonah, at his hard, unreadable face. She had her small bundle, always packed, always ready. It was her habit, the instinct of someone who knew any shelter could be temporary. She could run. But where? Jonah did not move. He simply looked at Davies, then at Anne Lee. He saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw the same steel he had seen at the train station. He gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. Not to her. To himself. A decision made. "She'll come to town tomorrow," Jonah said to Davies. "To talk to the sheriff herself." Davies's eyes narrowed, but his smile returned. "An excellent idea. Very sensible. I will see you both then." He mounted his horse and rode away, confident he had won. That night, the cabin was thick with tension. Samuel was agitated, pacing the small space. "You should have just let him take her. He'll bring the law down on us." Jonah ignored him. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, his movement slow and deliberate. Anne Lee went to her corner and pulled out the bundle of letters. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them still. She had to be calm. She had to be certain. She laid the letters out on the table in front of Jonah. "He is the one who wrote them," she said softly. Jonah stopped cleaning the rifle. He looked at the letters, then at her. He picked one up. The script was elegant, flowing. He read the lies about the prosperous store, the good friend Mr. Lee. Then he looked at the signature. It was a simple flourish. He walked to a small wooden box on the mantelpiece, a box of Martha's things he rarely touched. He took out a deed for their land. It was signed and stamped by the town clerk, Mr. Davies. He laid it on the table beside the letter. The signature was identical. The next day, they rode the wagon into Terminus. Anne Lee wore her blue cheongsam, a splash of defiant color against the snow. Her small bundle was at her feet. Jonah sat beside her, his face set like granite. Samuel, after a night of wrestling with his conscience, had insisted on coming, and sat in the back, his jaw tight with a new kind of resolve. The sheriff's office was warm. The sheriff himself, a man named Peters, was older, with a fair-minded reputation. Mr. Davies was already there, looking smug and concerned. "Sheriff," Davies began, "I am so glad you are here to resolve this delicate matter. This poor girl has been taken in by Mr. Bell, and while his intentions may be rustic, it is not a proper environment." Sheriff Peters looked at Lee. "This man says he's responsible for you." Before Lee could speak, Jonah stepped forward and laid the land deed and one of the letters on the sheriff's desk. "Look at the signatures, Sheriff." Peters put on his spectacles and peered at the two documents. He grunted. "Well, I'll be. Looks the same." Davies paled slightly but recovered quickly. "A coincidence. I often sign as a witness for town business. It proves nothing. He says the letters are from a Mr. Lee," and Lee said, her voice clear and steady. She had rehearsed this. She would not let her fear show. "He says Mr. Lee is a merchant in this town." She looked directly at the sheriff. "Is there such a man?" "No, the sheriff said, stroking his chin. "Never has been." "This is a misunderstanding," Davies blustered. "The girl is confused. She barely speaks the language." "I speak enough," Lee said, her voice gaining strength. She laid the rest of the letters on the desk. "He wrote of a store, Davies and Son, that sold silk and tea. He wrote of my husband's business. But there is no store. There is no husband. There is only him." She pointed a steady finger at Davies. "He paid for my passage. He brought me here with lies. You must ask him why." The sheriff looked at Davies, whose face was now slick with sweat. The respectable facade was cracking. The quiet dignity of the girl, the hard silence of the gunslinger beside her, and the identical signatures on the desk were forming a truth that was impossible to deny. The lie had been exposed not by shouting or violence, but by quiet certainty. "Mr. Davies," the sheriff said, his voice dangerously low, "I think you and I need to have a long talk about mail fraud. And maybe a few other things." Davies deflated. The fight went out of him, replaced by a desperate, wheedling fear. He was no longer a benefactor. He was just a small, corrupt man who had been seen. They left him there with the sheriff. They walked out into the cold, bright sunlight, the three of them. The air felt clean. They climbed back into the wagon, the silence on the ride home entirely different from the one on the ride in. It was a comfortable silence, a settled one. When they reached the cabin, Lee reached down for her bundle, the symbol of her readiness to leave. Jonah put a hand on her arm, stopping her. He looked at her, his gaze direct, stripped of all its old defenses. He saw not a fragile piece of porcelain, but the woman who had faced down a swindler, who had survived a blizzard, who had brought a quiet warmth back into his deadened home. He saw Lee. He reached down, took the small bundle from the floor of the wagon, and carried it inside. He did not put it in her corner. He walked over to the sturdy shelf he had built for her and placed it there, carefully. He was putting her departure away. He turned back to her. She stood in the doorway, framed by the light, waiting. He had so few words, and he had guarded them for so long. But now, one was necessary. One was true. "Stay," he said. It was not a command. It was not a bargain. It was a plea, and a promise. Lee looked at his face, at the wounded man who was slowly, painstakingly beginning to heal. She looked past him, into the small, rough cabin that had become the first place she had not been forced to earn her keep, but had been asked to belong. She stepped over the threshold, out of the cold and into the warmth. She was home. Thank you for watching.